Welcome to Hawkbar's Intro to Game Programming 101. So this is the syllabus I put together. I will share this information. I'll link to it in the description on YouTube once this VOD goes up. And I'll also post all these materials on in my Discord. I'll set up a section for this virtual class for anyone who wants to follow along. Today we're mostly just going to be going over the syllabus and installing all of the software we need for this course. And then we'll get started next week with our first big Hello World learning experience. 1 second. There we go. I need to get a way to adjust that without having to put that on screen. There we go. Cool. All right. So yeah, let's go over the syllabus really quick, cover what we're going to be learning. So, this Intro to Game Programming course is targeted at learners with some or little technical proficiency and little or no existing programming knowledge, and will cover the basics of writing game code in the C# programming language. Students will start with a Hello World example project and follow along with the video lectures as the project evolves step by step into a playable ASCII roguelike game over the duration of the course. So basically, we're going to be learning the basics of the C# programming language and some secondary things related to that, like how to manage versions of your code, how to share your code, how to run your code. And it's all going to be focused on doing little text-based experiments all on a console. Is the C sharp enough to cut bread? Excellent question, Yahoo. But yeah. So it's going to be very focused on the programming side of things. I know a lot of people who want to get into game design want to jump into 3D modeling and art and that sort of thing. But for this course, we're going to be focusing just on the programming fundamentals. The idea that if you can learn the basics here and get really comfortable with them, it'll make it a lot easier to move on to a more sophisticated course on like Unity or Unreal or another game engine. And if this course is very successful, then I will consider doing a follow-up course on making a full game in Unity. But for this one, we are focused just on C# programming fundamentals. So our objectives for this course are to create a text-based roguelike running in a C# command prompt, acquire fundamental programming skills and knowledge, acquire the ability to write simple programs in the C# programming language, understand common object-oriented patterns, especially those used in games, so some of the coding patterns that are very common to games, and get familiar with those, and ultimately be ready to transition to game development in the Unity game engine. Or other engines, but we're focusing on Unity since that uses C#. But we shouldn't be touching on Unity very much in this course, if at all. So, we have some required materials. We're going to be using the .NET 5.0 SDK, which is a set of programs from Microsoft that let you actually write C# code and convert it to programs that can actually be executed, EXEs on Windows or similar on other environments. Git, source control management, which is a set of command line utilities for working with different versions of source code. So being able to save your changes and roll them back. Do you use the cheers button to control the on-screen counter channel point reward? Yes, I do. It's pretty much just my proof of concept, just to show that the counters module works. So you can spend a few channel points
The power of science.
Yes, the power of science, exactly. So I use my stream pretty much just to demonstrate a lot of the CheersBot features in kind of their most bare bones versions. So yeah, install the .NET SDK, Git, and then we'll be using Visual Studio Code as our code editor. If you're more comfortable with something else, then you're welcome to use something else, but That is my recommended software of choice for writing C# code. I'm glad you like it so much. I did put a lot of work into it, and there are other tools on the market that do similar things, but I'm really happy with what I've done with it. And of course, installing Visual Studio Code will also need the C# extension for it, which adds support for writing C# code. Go figure. And then if you would like to make it easier to share your code with your classmates or with me or anyone else, or you're looking to share your code with Minecraft account instead of Microsoft. Well, technically, they are one and the same now in some ways. But yeah, so if you would like to do that, then I highly recommend picking up the Live Share extension for Visual Studio Code, which will kind of let you treat your code as kind of like a Google Doc, where you can invite other people to look at it and edit it with you. It's really nice for going over code with a teacher or classmates to try to figure out what's wrong with your code or look for feedback. And then for that, you'll need either a Microsoft account or a GitHub account. So you'll want to set one or both of those up. I won't go into all of that on stream today, but that is something to keep in mind. And there's no requirements for this class to publish your code, but I highly recommend learning how to do so. So those are the required materials. You don't have to buy any books or anything. I'll just be doing video lectures, probably 10 weeks, but if it ends up taking longer than I expect, then it might go longer than that, which I'll post on YouTube. Then, of course, I'll stream them live on Twitch as well. And then there'll be a sort of an informal take-home assignment with each lecture. Basically, just kind of here's all the concepts we learned in class. Now go modify your copy of the program to do this. I'm not grading anything. This isn't an exam or anything, but something to work on between lectures, because I will skip parts if they're really repetitive and don't involve new information. And then discussion tutoring will be available via my Discord server. I'll set up a section for talking about this course specifically. So yeah, that's the overall course structure. Now we can skim the course outline really quick. I won't go into too much detail, but just to see what we're covering and what kind of things we're learning each week. So week 0, because in programming arrays start at 0. You might have heard that one already. For session 0, we'll just be talking about the course, the syllabus, and setting up software. So I will run through installing most of this on stream here in a few minutes, but that'll involve setting up our development environment, installing necessary software, and then I'll show you a little bit of a sample project of the kinds of things you can expect from this course in terms of output. I don't have a full roguelite built quite yet, but you can see an example of what it's going to look like. So next week, session 1, we'll start with some basic Hello World stuff. I'm going to do some high-level discussion on things like how CPUs work at a high level, and how function calls work. So how you issue commands to the CPU and all of that. So basically just kind of the fundamentals of how programming really works. I won't expect anyone to understand it at a deep level, but I find that it helps to understand kind of really a high level how a computer thinks and how you need to work with a computer in order to cater to that. So we'll talk about that, and then the assignment for session 1 will be just to set up the Hello World source code and run it for the first topic. But then also during that session, we'll have a few other topics we'll touch, because this shouldn't take an entire 2-hour segment. So after that, we'll also talk about how memory works, how like your RAM works, and how that interacts with the CPU. The concepts of stack and heap, which are two aspects of how programs manage memory, and how that applies to the C# code we'll be writing. We'll also talk about variables, which are kind of one of the most fundamental aspects of programming, how to hold values in memory and change them. Touch a little bit on data types and what those mean. And getting user input. So how to take text from a user typing into the keyboard and do things with that. And we'll also learn about how to debug in Visual Studio Code. So how to run our code and watch what happens and how things change in order to see if we have any bugs and where those bugs are and how the program goes wrong. And then the assignment for that section will be to modify our hello world example to let the user type in their name and then have it say hello and then their name. So fairly simple change, but that'll be a good introduction to variables and all of that. And then finally, putting all of that together, we'll start talking a little bit about data types, the differences between numeric or text or Boolean values, and how to convert between them. And then we'll also talk a little bit about arithmetic, mathematical operators. Those are pretty fundamental, but they do work roughly how you expect in programming, and we can talk a little bit about that. And then we'll create a program based on our Hello World program that just takes two numbers that the user inputs and adds them together. Really basic, but should be a good way to demonstrate all the topics that we've covered so far. And the second session will be focused on control flow. So for that one, we're going to be building a guessing game where the program generates a random number and then the user has to try to guess it. And we'll be modifying it a few times as we go, as we learn new topics throughout that session. So we'll start off talking about random generation. How do we generate a random number? And what does that mean? Where do random numbers come from? And then we'll talk a little about if-else statements. So those are another very fundamental aspect of programming. How do you make the program do one thing if something happens and another thing if it doesn't happen? And branching, which is the technical term for that. And Boolean expressions, which are statements of true-false value. We'll get into that when we get to it. So our assignment will be to write a program that picks a number between 1 and 10, ask the user to pick and guess the number, and tell them if they were correct or not. So next we'll learn a little bit about Boolean variables and while loops, which are the fundamentals of how to make a program do one thing over and over again. So we'll be modifying our guessing game to repeat it until the user wins. So they can keep guessing until they win. And of course, that's not going to be that interesting, because if you can keep guessing until you win, then there's no stakes. So next we can learn about for loops, which is a way to run a loop only a certain number of times. And with that, we can modify it to have the user make a certain number of guesses. And if they get it right within that time, they win. Otherwise, they lose. And that should be it for session 2. It's pretty much all focused on that guessing game. Session 3 is going to be all about procedural programming, which is how games used to be written way back in the day, and it's still kind of one of the fundamental principles of game development is procedural programming. So we'll be talking about that in the context of making a narrative adventure game. So I can go ahead and demonstrate that so you understand what I'm talking about here. Give me one moment. I'm going to have Visual Studio Code here. So it's probably pretty hard to read, but this is just a regular like command prompt, like you'll see elsewhere in Windows or on Linux. And we're standing in an open clearing. There's a small shack to the north, and I can type north. You are in a small wooden shack. There is a door to the south. There is an axe hanging on the wall. And I can type axe. You take the axe. You are in a small wooden shack. There is a door to the south. South. You are standing in an open clearing. There's a small shack to the north. So one of those old-fashioned text-based adventure games, basically. We're going to be building that for the next couple of sessions, and then gradually expanding it and modifying it until eventually we can start building it into a proper RPG of sorts. So yeah, our first session will be focused on just creating a few little scenes like that, where the console just prints out a message describing where the person is, and then they can keep advancing it to get to the next part of the story. Kind of like just like the text in a visual novel. And then be able to add a little bit of user input so they can choose between different paths. If they want to go left or right, that sort of thing. And then our next topic will be about adding some persistency to that, adding variables and conditional logic to have the choices that the players make get saved and have the game remember later what they chose so they can treat them differently. Like if they chose to go left towards the beginning of the game, then maybe there's something different later on than if they chose to go right. So we'll add several branching paths to the narrative based on the previous choices, and we'll track all that using variables. After that, we'll start talking about functions, which are another very, very important programming principle, and one of the first things to be built after procedural programming was invented, which is basically a way of running the same code multiple times and changing how it runs depending on how it's being run, and specify different parameters to it that alter its behavior. So I'll be doing that to create a scene that gets used multiple times within this story, but is different in slightly different ways. So we'll call that, wrap some of this up in a function, and then call the function multiple times to add some modularity to our code. And then after that, we'll add some parameters to it so that it can the scene that we pull into this function can change depending on the scenario. Like maybe each time you run into the scene, there's some kind of clock inside it, and the clock changes every time you look at it. That sort of thing. So that's session 3. Session 4 is when we get into object-oriented programming, which is kind of the default programming philosophy in modern programming, especially in game programming. And there's some newer things being used elsewhere. But in game programming in particular, object-oriented programming is the standard. And there I'll be talking first about quite a few things: classes, fields, types versus instances, and constructors, reference variables, pointers, pass by value, pass by reference. There's going to be a lot of theoreticals going into this lecture, but we'll get to it. A lot of whiteboarding. But the goal of that initial assignment will be to take all of our variables throughout our program and move them to a single player construct that tracks all of the state about the player, all of the choices they've made, all of the things that they hold. And that'll just be a lot cleaner in the long run, being able to move all that into one place. Then we'll talk about even more advanced classes and object-oriented stuff, with talking about class methods, which are functions that are tied to a class, abstract classes, which is a way of requiring you to create a more specialized version of a class, simple inheritance, which is all about how to make one object behave similarly to another object. So we'll be taking all of our scenes and turning them into classes, which will be a lot of work, but will make our code so much cleaner in the long run. So that's all of session 4. Session 5 is taking all of that we've worked on and then changing it to be more like a real game engine. So this will make a lot more sense once we have the project up and running and you can see how your own code works, but we'll be changing it so that these new scene objects don't drive their behavior directly, but there's kind of an external engine that's controlling the scenes in the player and handling all of the important interactions between them. So for that, we'll learn about indirect function calls and polymorphic control flow, which are a lot of buzzwords, but trust me, it's not as scary as it sounds. And after that, we'll learn about inventory items, which of course are a very important thing in any adventure game or RPG. And for that, we need to learn about lists and arrays, which are ways to have multiple things in a variable instead of just one. I bet it's scarier than it sounds. Well, I guess we'll find out, won't we? Programming can be very scary, but if you get over that and it clicks for you, it's pretty awesome. But yeah, for that, we'll learn how to add a list of items that the player has and add ways to check if the player has a certain item, ways to add that item to the player's inventory or remove it. And then we can modify some of our scenes to add or remove items from the inventory or add or remove choices that the player has access to, depending on what items are in their inventory. And then from there, we'll also talk a bit about backtracking, about how to connect our scenes together in a more sophisticated manner. And for that, we'll talk a bit more about object references, private versus public scope, graphs as a high-level concept. And instead of having the scenes determine which the next scenes are, we'll have a way to statically define that, how to connect all of our scenes together, all of our rooms. So I don't have as much detail on these, so this should go pretty quickly. But that's session 5. Session 6, now that we've got all that fundamentals and we got kind of a little bit of an adventure game engine built up, we'll start talking about how to add some more meaningful gameplay mechanics. To start with, we'll have to modify our code a bit more. We'll talk about nested complex objects and lists of objects because we're going to turn our items into more sophisticated things rather than just a name of an item. You have a shovel, you don't have a shovel. We'll add things like sell value, like if you're going to sell an item to a shop, how much is it worth? And other kinds of properties to those items. And then we'll also add stats to the player, things like health, and to keep track of how much health they have, how much inventory space they have, that sort of thing. So starting to get into actual game mechanics. So we'll add the ability for the scenes to do damage to the player, add a game over scene if the player's health drops to 0. So then it becomes more of an actual game and not just a text adventure. And of course, once we have that, we need a way to display all that to the player. So in session 7, we'll talk more about how to expand our game engine code into something more sophisticated. And we'll add logic to draw a user interface, show like the player's current health and their inventory, and work on the loop for how to display the current state of rooms and how to interact with them. And that should all take place during session 7. And in session 8, we'll finally be getting to combat. So we're going to build a very simple turn-based combat system We'll go back to randomization and talk about how to make random monster behavior or random hit chances for attacks. And we'll define some enemies that you can fight against. Exactly. So we'll create a special kind of scene, which is a loop between the player and enemy where they keep attacking each other until one side is killed. Maybe if you're feeling adventurous, you can code a way for the player to run away or escape. And then once we got our really basic combat system set up, we'll start developing enemies. So we'll define enemy classes and subclasses that define how each enemy behaves, what type of attacks they have, what their stats are, all of those sorts of things. And things like enemy drops, XP values, all of that. And we'll create all these enemies and plug them into our combat system. So we can run into multiple different enemy encounters and have them behave differently. So that'll be session 8. In session 9, we'll be putting some finishing touches on the project. So we'll make a little bit of a 2D overworld map, kind of like old ASCII roguelikes did, where you can see where you are on the map and any adjacent rooms, if there's any enemies in the rooms. And to do that, we'll need to learn about nested loops and 2D lists. Because lists are normally one-dimensional. They are just a single flat list, but if you make a list of lists, you can make it two-dimensional. Then we'll learn how to loop through all of that in order to draw our map. And so we'll be able to use our existing scenes, our room system, and plug that into the map to demonstrate where all the rooms are and how they connect. That should be really cool. And then for those feeling adventurous, we'll also touch a little bit on ASCII techniques, how to make ASCII art and add color to things. So we can add a little bit more visual interest to our game. And that's basically all. That's where we're going to end up. That's our syllabus. So it may end up taking longer than 10 weeks, depending on the pace of some of these sessions. I've never done this before, so I don't know exactly how it's all going to work out, but bear with me, and we'll see how it goes. So this session is definitely going to be one of the shortest ones. We're not getting too far into it, but I will go ahead and walk through how to download and install all of these things on Windows, so we can be ready to go next time. So you finish the whole thing by remaking Dwarf Fortress. Got it. Yep, basically. I will probably not build a game quite that complicated on stream during the lectures, but my goal is to create a framework so that you can take the things that you learned during the lectures and expand them as much as you would like for your game. If you want to add more complicated mechanics, I want to give you the tools to do that on your own time. Although coding everything in Dwarf Fortress might be a bit of a tall order for 10 weeks. That is a tremendously complex game. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and open some of these tabs up. I already have some of these installed, but I'll re-download and reinstall them just to demonstrate how this works. So you'll come here to the .NET 5.0 download page. That's how it's supposed to work. Gotta spend your channel points on something. So yeah, you want to download the latest version of the SDK. SDK stands for Software Development Kit, and basically it includes all of the code and tools that you need to write C# code. If you're just looking to run C# programs, then all you need is the runtime. You've probably seen a lot of games on Steam or other platforms require you to download something called like a C++ redistributable. That's kind of the same idea as this. So if you're creating a game with C#, you'll usually need your users to install one of these runtimes. But there's a good chance they already have it on Windows because Windows Update will automatically install it for you. in most cases. So let's go ahead and download the correct version of the SDK for our computer. I'm running Windows 64-bit, so that's the one I want. You can get the appropriate one for your platform. All these tools run on Windows, Mac, and the most popular flavors of Linux. So no matter what device you have, you should be able to follow along. So this will take a minute to download. The SDK is rather large. There we go. Go ahead and run that installer. I'll just let it do its thing. Nice, and it crashed. Okay. Let's see. Well, I guess it's not going to let me do it, but what you want to do is just run through that and install it as it prompts you to do so. I don't think there's any choices or anything you have to make. You just have to keep going through it until it's done. Next, let's install VS Code next. So you'll go to the link I'll post in the syllabus and just download the latest version. It should automatically give you the right version for your operating system. If not, you can go to the download page and find the right one. Let me close that, maybe that's why. Okay, I'm already running code, so let me close all that down. Wait. There we go. So this is pretty straightforward. Agree to the license agreement, install the program. Here, there are a few things you'll want to do, unless you decide you don't want to do them, I guess. But at the very least, you want to make sure add to path is checked. Register code as an editor for supported file types. You probably want to check that, unless you already use a different code editor. And I personally recommend checking the Open with Code option for the Windows Explorer directory context menu. If you don't like polluting your right-click menus on Windows, then you can leave those unchecked and do it by hand, but I find it saves me a lot of time in the long run. And I'm going to exit out of it because I already installed it, but you run that and it's done. That's the only choice you have to make after that. And then if you're going to use source control, and I highly recommend it, then you'll want to download Git. So as usual, download the appropriate version for your operating system and run the installer. If you're using Unix or Linux, then I trust that you can figure things out from the setup instructions. So here in the Git setup, you'll probably want to check Get LFS is going to be really useful if you ever use this for Unity, so I'd recommend that one. And then associate Git with configuration files with the default text editor. That one's good. Associate .sh files to be run with Bash. That's optional, up to you. And yeah, that should be it. For adjusting the name of the initial branch to new repositories, you can leave that as let Git decide. But if you find the term master unpleasant or has negative connotations for you, then you can click this option to change it to main. For SSH, use the bundled OpenSSH executable. Default behavior of get pull, leave it as default. Which credential helper should be configured? Use the default selected one. And for experimental options, I would leave them unchecked. And let that run. And we're done. So you shouldn't ever have to use Git directly in most cases. Visual Studio Code provides an interface for doing so. But if you would like to get more efficient with it, there are plenty of courses online on how to learn the command line tools for Git. So now that all that's out of the way, let me walk you through installing things within Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code here in a new window. And first things first, let's install those extensions. So come over here to the sidebar. Here I can zoom in a bit here. Make it easier to see. So we'll come over here to the sidebar to this extensions option. And this will show a search window for extensions. You want to search for the C# extension. Click that. And there should be an install button here. You'll click install and wait for that to run. And that should be it. It should be installed there. And then if you'd like to use that live share extension that I mentioned for collaborating with other people or getting help with your code, you can come here and install the live share extension. Similarly, there'll be an install button. You just click that, it runs, and you're done. Very straightforward. And with that, your setup should be good to go. So to make sure that everything is working as expected, we can go ahead and set up a Hello World project just to demonstrate and be ready for the future coursework. So you can come here to Open Folder, File Open Folder, or you can select Open Folder from here. And then let's find a place to do this. I'm going to go ahead and create a folder here called Code Class. So you'll want to create an empty folder that will be the name of your code project. So here I'm going to call this Intro to Programming. And I'm not going to use any spaces. It's just going to be all one word with capitalization to separate each of the words. So Intro to Programming. And I just created this folder. It's an empty folder. And then I'll select that with Visual Studio Code, select folder. Now you can see there's the name of that folder here in the title bar. And we look over here at Open Editors, there's nothing in there. And that's where we want to be. We've got an empty folder and it's open in Visual Studio Code. So now to make sure that our .NET 5.0 SDK installed correctly, we can go ahead and run the command to create a new project. So if you give me a moment, let me look that up. There we go. Okay. .NET new console -F net 5.0. So this will create a new console application using .NET 5.0 as the standard. And if everything's set up correctly, that should just run. Say it's created successfully. Then you'll see a project file that says Intro to Programming, or whatever you named your folder. And there should just be some stuff in there. And then there's program.cs, which is our Hello World program. Look at that, it just created it for us. Now you should see this pop up here in Visual Studio Code after you've set up the project and opened program.cs. Say required assets to build and debug are missing from Intro to Programming, add them. And you want to say yes. So that's going to add a .vs code folder here with some scripts automatically set up for you. And now that all that's done, we can come here to this run and debug option and just click the green arrow. And it's going to take a few seconds to build our application. And right there in the debug console, hello world. So you can see that it ran. The code says, write to the console, hello world. And there on the console, there it is. There is one thing we are going to change really quick, though, here in this VS Code folder. So if you go to launch.json, find the line that says console, change that to external terminal. And I don't expect you to understand what's going on here. Just follow along, copy and paste that in. Change console to external terminal, capital T. And now if we come here and run it again, well, it's going to close immediately, but it opened up a new terminal window. So I'll show you what that looks like here. I'm just adding a thing to prevent it from closing. There we go. So it opened up a new command prompt, and it says hello world in it. So yeah, that's our setup. That went pretty quickly, honestly. A little less than an hour. But that's session 0. So I will see y'all next time for session 1, where we'll talk a little bit more about this Hello World application and what it's doing, and modify it a bit.